behalf of IFIM, welcome to the fourth installment of the Sustainable Finance webinar, brought to you in collaboration with the World Bank Group Malaysia and the Asian Institute of Chartered Bankers, AICB. Ladies and gentlemen, policymakers and investors are increasingly recognizing the importance of climate change and its implications on the financial sector. It is with that in mind, today's webinar shall focus on the introduction to climate-related financial disclosures, whereby our panelists will deep dive into the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, in short TCFD, and its recommendations. To ensure the resilience of the financial system, the TCFD recommends that companies, including financial institutions, disclose the exposure that each institution has towards climate-related risk and how these risks are being managed. This will result in better risk management and a more informed strategic planning for investors' strategic decision-making. We are privileged today to have Ms. Suraya Sani. She is the Senior Supervisor, Financial Conglomerate Supervision Department of Bank Negara Malaysia, as our moderator today. Good morning, Ms. Suraya. She will be joined by three panelists, comprises of representatives from the Carbon Disclosure Project, or CDP, out of Hong Kong, and Standard Chartered based in Singapore. Without further ado, I shall pass the mic to Ms. Suraya to commence the discussion. Over to you, Ms. Suraya.
Thank you, Encik Khairi. Assalamualaikum, good morning, and hello everyone. Welcome to IFIM webinar on Introduction to Climate-Related Financial Disclosure. Thank you for taking your time to join us today. I'm very pleased to be the moderator for the session today. In recognition of the growing significance of climate change and the risk climate change could pose to businesses, there is a growing call for companies to disclose the climate-related risks they are facing as well as opportunities. While many companies across a variety of sectors recognize the importance of disclosure and taking the early steps to report, reporting is still not that consistent. In June 2017, the Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosure, TCFD, released its final recommendations on the framework for developing improved climate-related financial disclosures through the existing reporting processes. This webinar shall introduce participants to the current disclosure practices and highlight key challenges as well as provide recommendations. I'm very pleased to introduce our presenters today. Our first presenter is Ms. Ellen Kwok. Ms. Ellen is a Senior Project Officer in the Corporate Engagement Team at CDP. As an international environmental non-profit organization that drives climate, water, and forest data disclosure. She will provide overview of TCFD recommendations and some highlights on analysis of what banks are doing to implement TCFD based on CDP data. Secondly, we have here with us today Ms. Hani Khalid. Ms. Hani is the Engagement Manager at CDP, where she focuses on engagement with financial institutions in Southeast Asia. Hani works closely with banks to facilitate and support environmental disclosure to investors. Hani will be presenting on CDP's questionnaire that is designed for financial institutions. And our third presenter for today is Mr. Ryan. Mr. Ryan is a Director of Environmental and Social Risk Management at Standard Chartered Bank. He has over 13 years of experience in the financial services and banking industry. And he will be sharing with us Standard Chartered's experience in implementing TCFD, how disclosure have evolved from pre-TCFD and post-TCFD. Before we dive into the topic of our discussion today, just a couple of housekeeping items I would like to highlight. If you'd like to ask questions, you can certainly do so by clicking the Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen, and please feel free to ask any questions. I will raise the questions with the panelists during the Q&A session. The webinar is being recorded, and the recording can be found on IPFAM's YouTube channel in 2 days' time. Now I would like to welcome our first presenter, Ms. Eileen. Over to you, Eileen.
Thank you, Suraya. And also thank you for inviting me to today's webinar. My name is Ellen, and as mentioned, I'm part of Hong Kong's CDP Corporate Engagement team. And for the next 15 minutes, I will give a high-level overview of CDP and then TCFD, followed by findings from our most recent TCFD analysis of more than 2,500 companies across Asia Pacific. So for those of you who are not familiar with us, CDP is a non-profit organization that runs the world's leading corporate disclosure platform. And to gather corporate environmental data, we develop and issue questionnaires across 3 themes. They are climate change, water security, and deforestation questionnaires. And CDP issues requests for corporate environmental data on behalf of 2 authorities groups, which are our investor signatories on the top you can see from the slide, and the large purchasing organizations on the bottom. And the data that we collect will then share back with our investor signatories and our supply chain members. As indicated in the graphic to the left, our questionnaires are aligned with the recommendations of the TCFD. And the information that companies submit reaches not only to CDP's investor signatories, but also users of the various outlets in the capital markets. For example, ISS uses CDP data to assign its ESG ratings, while Goldman Sachs uses CDP data to create specialized index. As such, by filing a CDP report, you're not only aligned with the TCFD recommended disclosures, but you do so in a way that connects with global financial markets. We are also very pleased to see financial institutions across Asia Pacific are beginning to use CDP scores to grant sustainability-linked loan. For example, the NYK Group in Japan received its first sustainability-linked loan last year from one of our investor signatories, MUFG Bank, where the loan's interest rate is linked to CDP's annual scores. Here we have some figures that give a sense of CDP's global operations. Last year, over 8,400 corporates worldwide submitted a response to CDP, including 2,500 in APAC. As I mentioned, these companies responded either to requests of our 515 signatories or the 150 large purchasers that use our supply chain program to engage with suppliers. In addition, 920 subnational governments disclosed through our cities, states, and regions program, including 9 cities in Malaysia. And since today a lot of our audience are from Malaysia, I want to quickly highlight that out of that 9 responding Malaysian cities, 3 of them actually scored A. And across the Greater China region and Southeast Asia, there are only 11 cities made it to our A list. So well done. Now, I hope that now you have a better understanding of how CDP works and how do we fit in the environmental disclosure ecosystem. Let's now move on to how CDP interacts with TCFD reporting specifically. But before that, I wanted to quickly recap what TCFD is. As you're likely aware, in 2015, over 190 countries came together to sign the Paris Agreement, which aims to limit the rise in global temperature to well below 2 degrees compared to pre-industrial levels. And to that end, G20 finance ministers asked the Financial Stability Board to review how climate risks were priced and accounted for, which led to the FSB setting up the TCFD to prepare guidelines for companies to measure and report on climate-related issues. And the TCFD ultimately issued a series of recommendations in connection with our 4 pillars of disclosures in here, which are governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. The 4 pillars are supported by 11 recommended climate-related financial disclosure, and my colleague Hani will talk more about these disclosures later. Now, these TCFD recommendations are designed to help investors and others to understand how reporting organizations consider and assess climate-related risk and opportunities, and what are the financial impacts. For this reason, the TCFD framework can also be considered along with other general risk management. Climate-related risk to a business fall broadly into 2 categories. They are transition risk or physical risk. So for transition risk, they are risks that a business is likely to face in our global transition to a low-carbon economy. And this risk may manifest through policy and legal risk, technology risk, and market changes. As for physical risk, they can be further divided into acute or chronic. Acute physical risks are event-driven, such as typhoons or floods, while chronic risk involve longer-term climate pattern shifts, such as high temperatures that cause sea level rise. So far, I've been talking a lot on climate-related risk. However, it's actually not all gloom and doom. Companies are also actively reporting their climate-related opportunities through CDP. Some examples of opportunities companies have identified are increased resource efficiency and shifting to climate resilient or renewable energy sources. And this diagram here presents how risk and opportunities I mentioned just now should also be integrated into companies' strategic planning. In addition, disclosure information like potential financial impacts caused by the identified risk and opportunities can help investors, lenders, and insurers to make informed financial decisions. And businesses are encouraged to evaluate and disclose this information as part of companies' annual financial filing preparation and reporting processes. So, the TCFD was tasked to develop a set of climate disclosure recommendations that are financially relevant, but they're not a reporting platform. And to enable companies to report aligned with the TCFD, CDP included these TCFD-related questions in our climate questionnaire. And to emphasize the degree of alignment between CDP and TCFD, I've reproduced the findings of an organization called the Corporate Reporting Dialogue, which is a joint effort of the 4 organizations or standards you see here, which are CDP, GRI, SASB, and IR. And the results of its Better Alignment project, which evaluated each framework's degree of alignment with the recommendations of TCFD, shows that among the 4 frameworks, CDP is the one that features full alignment with the TCFD recommendations. In the following slides, I'll provide a high-level analysis we recently did to examine the TCFD alignment amongst companies in Asia-Pacific. And here is the sample we used for the following analysis. As I mentioned, last year there are over 2,500 companies across APEC reported via CDP's climate change questionnaire. And these submissions include companies that responded to both investors and customer requests. And as explained, CDP's questionnaire is designed to align with the information requested with the TCFD. So we have structured our analysis in alignment with the 4 pillars set by TCFD. And let's begin with governance. So in the governance module of our questionnaire, we ask companies to report on their board-level oversights and incentives in place for management of climate-related issues. And from our analysis, close to 80% of companies identify that they have board-level oversight of climate-related issues. And when we ask them if they are providing incentives for management level for managing these issues, close to 60%, which is a considerable amount of respondents, said that they do provide incentives. But they're not necessarily monetary reward. They can be employee awards or increased holiday allowances. And we found that only 13% reported that they have financial remuneration, such as bonuses, that are tied to environmental initiatives for their C-suite or above, which CDP regards as best practice. As we all know, monetary incentives is a key motivator for employees. So by looking at a high proportion of companies with board-level oversight, in contrast to the relatively low portion of companies with best practice incentives, it may suggest that there's a gap between the ambitions of boards and the incentives offered to the senior managers responsible for achieving these ambitions. With regard to strategy, we ask companies to disclose whether they have acted upon integrating climate issues into their business strategy. And of those who have integrated it into their business strategy, only around half of them have conducted a scenario analysis. And as recognized by the TCFD, companies are encouraged to use climate-related scenario analysis to assess the potential effects of climate change on their businesses and strategies. For example, if the results of an analysis indicates that area where the company operates would be greatly affected by sea level rise, then they can formulate adaptation or mitigation measures accordingly. And finally, nearly 3/4 of those who haven't applied a scenario analysis yet anticipate conducting one by 2021. And therefore, we expect more companies in the region to start integrating scenario analysis, and hopefully it will become a standard practice among businesses in Asia Pacific. And moving to risk management, 2/3 of companies identified climate-related risk that their businesses exposed to. And of the risk identified by companies, 56% are transition risk. And the most common transition risk is policy and legal related, such as pricing of greenhouse gas emissions or regulations on existing products and enhanced reporting obligations. One good example reported by companies is that the Singaporean government has put a price on carbon last year. And among physical risk, the most commonly cited one is increased severity of weather events such as typhoons and floods. And for example, an infrastructure company reported that changes in rainfall patterns have led to more floods at their construction sites, which has then limited construction activities and risk, potentially delaying their project program. And finally, we come to the last TCFD pillar, which is targets and metrics. And 68% of companies reported that they have an emissions target set for the companies. But when we ask companies to report their change in gross global emissions compared to the previous reporting year, as you can see here, a total of 36% of companies in APAC reporting lower emissions last year compared to the previous reporting year. And this is, however, somewhat undermined by the reality that 23% companies have witnessed an increase in emissions. While many companies have set targets to reduce emissions, it is also important to set targets that are ambitious enough to make sure that we can achieve the Paris Agreement goal. And this also indicates the importance of setting target that is science-based. So Just to quickly give you an introduction on what is a science-based target. Greenhouse gas emission reduction target that is considered science-based when it is consistent with what the latest climate science says is necessary to achieve the Paris Agreement, and to help the private sector in defining, promoting best practice in target setting. The SBTI, or Science-Based Target Initiative, was launched in 2014. And it develops guidance, tools, and technical assistance to facilitate the adoption of science-based targets. Last year, the number of targets validated by the SBTI in APAC doubled compared to 2018. And we noticed the SBT is gaining more traction in Southeast Asia, and we expect the positive growth trend of SBTs in Southeast Asia will continue. So the next slide is the last slide for my presentation. And before I finish, I just wanted to quickly highlight that while the TCFD framework is applicable to all sectors, it is particularly applicable to the 5 sectors listed here and the following subsectors you can see on the slide. And the reason being that companies in these sectors directly influence climate change and are also, as a consequence, likely to have the most impact. And my colleague Hani later will talk more about how banks and financial sector can align their disclosures to TCFD. So thank you, and this is the end of my presentation. Over to you.
Thank you, Ellie. That was a very good presentation with lots of good information. So let's move on to our second presenter, Ms. Hani. Over to you, Ms. Hani.
Thank you so much, Soraya. I hope everyone can hear me loud and clear. Assalamualaikum and happy Monday, everyone. Hope all of you are well and healthy. My name is Hani and I'm the Engagement Manager at Capital Markets in CDP. Before I start, I would like to thank World Bank, Asian Institute of Chartered Bankers, and the Islamic Banking and Finance Institute Malaysia for inviting webinar. I will be presenting on CDP Financial Services Questionnaire, Climate Change and Forest Pilot 2020 as a roadmap to start your journey in TCFD reporting. However, before I introduce our pilot questionnaire, let me highlight the growing support and demand of TCFD report. Demand of international inclination to drive a task force on climate-related financial disclosure adoption. And in Malaysia, Bank Negara Malaysia climate strategy comprises of 5 key thrusts, and one of it is to strengthen regulatory and supervisory expectation for managing climate risk. That is expense set by Bank Negara Malaysia for financial institutions to effectively manage climate and environmental risk. This includes improving disclosure in line with the recommendation of TCFD. Other regulators in Malaysia, such as Bursa Malaysia and Securities Commission Malaysia, are an official supporter of TCFD reporting. And in fact, Bursa Malaysia has also incorporated the TCFD recommendation into their 2018 Sustainability Reporting Guide. In Singapore, Monetary Authority of Singapore has recently released a consultation paper on the proposed guidelines on environmental risk management for financial institutions, and proposed that financial institutions take reference from recommendation of TCFD to guide the environmental risk disclosure. In New Zealand, it will be the first country in the world to require climate risk reporting. The new regime will be on comply or explain basis based on TCFD, which is widely acknowledged as international best practice. And apart from the financial regulators, investors such as BlackRock and Bessie are also asking companies that they invest in to disclose climate-related risks in line with the TCFD recommendation. So with the growing support of TCFD recommendation and to expand our sector-based questionnaire, we have developed Financial Services Climate Change and Forest Pilot Questionnaire in 2020 that is fully aligned with TCFD recommendation. A brief background on the development of the pilot questionnaire. The financial services sector represents a large portion of companies that will engage on the disclosure side. Around 50% of the total companies that disclose through CDP. This is new look on some of the work that we have been doing within the sector. In previous years, CDP climate change questionnaire was very operationally focused. A large number of the financial services companies that have responded to us in the past years were predominantly responding on an operational basis, focusing on their direct operation. For example, disclosing on their energy usage in their buildings and business travel. So the key highlight of the TCFD recommendation is the importance of indirect financing impact. So with that context, we introduced this new financial services climate change and forest pilot questionnaire, expanding the focus of disclosure to finance emissions in banks' lending portfolio, which are scope 3 category 15 investments, while at the same time de-emphasize the operational focus. The intention of this is to create a positive feedback loop where the financial institutions will have to get information from their clients, which will drive a much greater demand for environmental data and help to drive an improved environmental and quantity of disclosure and transparency among companies that will support financial institutions to assess their exposure to climate and forest-related risks and opportunities. So therefore, CDP pilot questionnaire focuses on banks' lending portfolio to incentivize the redirection of capital to finance the transition in the economy. CDP Financial Services Questionnaire Climate Change and Forest Pilot 2020 is an integrated questionnaire that has banks fully aligned with TCFD recommendations. Integration in this way will benefit banks because reporting in response to one questionnaire rather than two reduces reporting burden, and banks like yourself conceptually look at this issue holistically as ESG rather than separately as climate change, forest, and water. Therefore, and including the asset owners, managers, and insurance as part of CDP integrated questionnaire for financial services. Our theory of change is that better disclosure of impact financing are having on climate and forests, as well as the risk it represents to banks, will lead to actions and improve environmental outcome. So we believe disclosure can be a catalyst for action, because in making this information more transparent, it assists stakeholders such as investors and regulators in engaging on these issues, finding solutions, and using the leverage to promote positive change. So as mentioned earlier by Elim, risk management is one of the pillars of TCFD recommendation, where organizations are encouraged to disclose how they identify, assess, and manage climate-related risks. So how does forest play an important role in addressing the climate-related risks? Managing forest-related risks are actually very critical to address the climate crisis. Very critical from this slide. If tropical deforestation were a country, it will rank third in CO2 emissions, and research have shown even with all other anthropogenic emissions spaced out, they still drive global heating above 2 degrees by 2100. So forest-related risk is an underestimated risk for business. Hence, we have developed the pilot questionnaire covering both themes to show its importance and alignment to TCFD recommendations. So next question you might be asking, how does CDP pilot questionnaire help banks like yourself to build a TCFD report? This slide shows a schematic visualization of how CDP aligns its questionnaire with the recommendation of TCFD. TCFD recommendation proceeds from the starting point that climate change is a financial risk. Starting point and all peers and recommendation indicate to investors and companies what they should be evaluating. By means of our pilot questionnaire, CDP provides banks with a breakdown recommendations into accessible metrics designed to elicit data that allows stakeholders and the bank to evaluate their performance against the recommendations, which I will show example in later slides. Our guidance materials and supporting content inform banks exactly what bureaus for, rationale of the questions, and what information needs to be provided in a granular approach. Therefore, banks use our guidance to identify, collect, and report relevant data. Our scoring methodology also incentivizes fulsome disclosure and rewards banks for following best practices. So the outcome of the disclosure is a standardized, comparable, and decision-useful data. Therefore, CBP in a yield structured data sets which provides the bank with actionable insight. Now let's deep dive into CBP pilot questionnaire that are aligned with TCFD recommendation. So again, as mentioned earlier by Aline, the task force structure is recommendation around 4 thematic areas represents 4 elements of how companies operate, which are governance, strategy, risk management, and metrics and targets. The 4 overarching recommendations are supported by 11 recommended disclosures that build out a framework with information that will help stakeholders, especially investors, understand how reporting companies assess climate-related risks and opportunities highlighted in this slide. So there is a lot going on in this slide, my apology, but I included it to illustrate the extent to which CDP pilot questionnaire is aligned with TCFD recommended disclosure. You will notice that some of TCFD pillars, strategy, risk management, and metrics and target. So in total, there are 31 pilot questions that are aligned with What this means is that in practical terms, what this means is that every bank questionnaire is also producing a TCFD with clear. Our questionnaire also incentivizes companies to provide detailed, company-specific, and from an investor point of view, a decision-useful information. As such, in order to receive a leadership level CDP score, companies must provide comprehensive responses to each of these questions. So now that we have a broad idea of how CDP pilot questionnaire incorporates the TCFD recommendation for banks, we can take a high-level overview of how CDP questions guide banks on implementing the TCFD recommendation. Moving on to the first pillar of TCFD recommendation, governance. So this question provides an indication of the importance of environmental-related issues to an organization business. Stakeholders such as investors are interested in organizations understanding an approach to climate and forest-related risks at the board level, how aligned this is with organizational strategy, plans of action, management policies, and how does the board monitors progress against targets and goals for addressing climate and forest-related issues. So for the recommended disclosure, circle in red, describe the board's oversight of climate-related risks and opportunities. In our pilot questionnaire on the right-hand side of the slide, we have broken it down to a more granular approach, where we ask the frequency of the meeting, the teams, governance mechanisms into which climate and forest-related issues are integrated, and scope of the board level oversight. An example of a bank that is taking the right steps in governance is Citigroup. According to Citigroup CDP Climate Change Public Response, their risk management committee of the board of directors approved key risk policies, including environmental and social risk. The committee met 16 times in the initiatives that the risk management committee oversees includes updates to Citigroup environmental and social risk management policy, including the addition of new policy prohibition and sector standards. With regards to TCFD, our questionnaire asks both about TCFD and forest-related issues into business strategy as a whole, and about companies' use of scenario analysis. Climate-related scenario analysis is an important forward-looking tool for organizations to better understand the uncertainties and financial implications of transitioning to a low-carbon economy. And CDP scoring methodology incentivizes companies to carry out and report on scenario analysis. One example of a bank using climate-related scenario analysis is Bank of America, where they have planned scenarios with 7 shot over a relatively short time horizon. To analyze how transition risks could impact their clients, Bank of America tested 2 hypothetical event-based scenarios to see how each could impact companies in one of the sectors most exposed to climate-related risks, oil and gas sector. They examined this this transition risk with the intent to better understand the sensitivity of the creditworthiness of oil and gas companies to policies and market changes linked to the transition to a low-carbon economy. The analysis was run under two different potential scenarios, both companies with a 2 degrees or lower pathway on a sample of their oil and gas portfolio. So next is the risk management pillar. The TCFD recommendations highlight the importance of considering environmental related issues in the context of financing activities. Therefore, this recommended disclosure asks about processes used in making financing decisions such as portfolio analysis and credit risk assessments. When evaluating exposure, banks should primarily consider the impact on their lending in addition to operational activities. This information helps investors particularly to assess the potential impacts to valuation and the adequacy of the bank's risk exposure. So another example of response is Morgan Stanley. For their physical risk identification process, they assess the potential impacts of risk including flooding, rising sea levels, hurricanes, and extreme heat to understand where there may be potential for substantive impacts. Climate change is affecting the frequency, intensity, and nature of these physical events. Therefore, they regularly reference the latest climate science so that they can understand the current probabilities of certain events occurring, and having begun developing partnership with academic and research organizations to draw upon their expertise. And finally, we come to the last of the TCFD pillars, metrics and targets. Questions in metrics and targets pillar focuses on emissions, low carbon energy targets, and details of emissions reduction initiative. Target setting is crucial since it provides a direction and structure to environmental strategy. Hence, providing information on quantitative targets, qualitative goals, and progress made against these targets can demonstrate organizations' commitments to improve climate-related issues. This information is relevant to stakeholders' understanding of how companies addressing and monitoring their progress. One final example from Lloyds Bank in CDP Pilot Questionnaire FS 7.2a. Provide details of your targets to increase low carbon energy consumption or production that is aligned with TCFD recommendation, metrics and targets A. Lloyds has announced that it has sold electricity globally since January 2019. The bank aims to increase the proportion of electricity sourced via additional renewable projects, which will not otherwise be involvement, to at least 60% by 2025, and highlight that they are also developing a strategy to accelerate their plans to tackle climate change with their commitments for carbon reduction and energy efficiency. That's the end of my presentation. I hope my presentation has provided you clarity on how working through CDP questionnaire can guide banks on implementing the TCFD recommendation. Thank you so much, and over to you, Soraya.
Thank you, Hani. Thank you for the presentation. Your slides are very insightful, but we had difficulties to hear you clearly. I think it's because of the connection issue. Hani, appreciate if you could share your email address at the chat box. So any of the participants that would like to engage you, they can email you directly. So we can move on to our third presenter, Mr. Ryan. Over to you, Ryan.
Great, thank you very much. And thank you everybody for having me today. Bear with me for 1 second while I share my slides. Great, thank you very much. So I hope everybody can see my slides and hear me loud and clear. My name is Ryan Bjorkquist. I'm Director of Environmental and Social Risk here at Standard Chartered Bank, based in Singapore. For the next few minutes, I'm going to provide a brief overview of who we are at Standard Chartered, an introduction to sustainable finance and our approach to how we approach sustainable finance, and then transition into our recent climate-related financial disclosures and how we approached that as well. So who are we? Standard Chartered, we're in over 60 markets globally. We've been around for over 150 years. We are an emerging markets bank, so most of our markets are in Asia, Africa, and the Middle East, which puts us in a really unique position as it relates to climate-related risk. Specifically in ASEAN and South Asia, we're in 15 markets and 15 of the key markets. So like I said, we are prevalent across Asia, Africa, and the Middle East. Our footprint covers most of the markets that are impacted by climate change and environmental and social issues. Our hope is that we can leverage our position and our presence in those markets to bring about the positive change that we are expecting when it comes to climate-related risk and financial investment as it relates to climate change. Our approach to sustainable finance can be focused on three main themes. The first one being a responsible institution. So how are we managing our potential impact, both climate-related for our operations as well as our investments and our clients as well. Delivering sustainable finance where it matters most. So what markets are being most impacted by these changes, both physical risk related, and Ellen and Hani have already spoken at length about that, as well as where's best for investment with low carbon technology and things like that. Thirdly, our positive impact to our communities and environment. How do we go about it? We have an extensive team of sustainable finance professionals, both here in Singapore and in London. We try our best to identify opportunities that fall within that environmental and social perspective for positive impact and financing. So what is sustainable finance? It's pretty basic in the sense that it's any form of financial service that integrates environmental, social, and governance-related criteria in any business decision or investment decision. And that's one of the key strategies that we use when we're operating in the sustainable finance space. So that would include things like impact investing, microfinance, green bonds, blue bonds, and the like. But the key point that I would like to make for sustainable finance is that the result must have an environmental and social benefit. So when we're engaging with clients on sustainable finance products, we are really trying to identify the opportunities available, not only for the client, but for the community that we're doing business in and ourselves. Thirdly, does the opportunity help us achieve the UN Sustainable Development Goals? So one of the key philosophies for us here at Standard Chartered is trying to align to the Sustainable Development Goals for the business that we do. So we have several product offerings that allow us to do that. Green loans and sustainably linked loans. And sustainably linked loans are ones that are basically tied to a KPI. And so oftentimes we'll use something like the CDP to track performance of clients and then provide an incentive if they meet those performance indicators. Green bonds and blue bonds as well are probably the other two that we mostly hear about in the market. And those are dedicated funding for specific assets or proceeds. And then we also include sustainable bonds and social bonds as well. Lastly, something that is unique that we're pretty proud of is our sustainable deposit program. So we also have a corporate product that allows our clients to dedicate their funds to sustainable assets, and we have a framework which we use to identify and classify those assets as sustainable. So lastly, before we get into the disclosure piece, I just want to spend a minute on our philosophy. As I said, we align ourselves to the Sustainable Development Goals. We're aware that there's a $2.4 trillion financing gap in emerging and low-income countries for those SDGs. There's not enough investment there today, and that is one of the opportunities that we see going forward. Achieving these global targets, specifically CO2 and climate-related targets, are mainly going to be driven by Africa and Asia, and that's something that we see. We feel like we're uniquely positioned with our footprint that we have a direct opportunity to make that investment and really see some positive change there, as those are some of our key markets. And lastly, 60% of those SDGs are currently financed in developing markets. So there is a gap there. We know that there's a lot of work to do. So moving into disclosures, one of our philosophy points is responsible finance, and that includes our governance strategy, climate-related strategy, and things like that. So in regards to the TCFD, so Standard Chartered has currently released 2 TCFD reports. Our first one was in 2018, and our most recent one was in December 2019. Looking forward, we are hoping to release our 3rd report in early 2021. So that is something that we're actively working on today. And one of the key, one of the key strategies in the reporting process is trying to identify and report on the progress that we're making over time. And you can kind of see that from our first report in 2018 to the most current one today. So as Ellen had mentioned earlier, there are 4 key pillars that are part and parcel to the TCFD: governance, strategy, risk management, and the metrics and target setting. And that's what I'm going to go over here in the next few minutes. So if we look back at our most recent report, we provide updates on several things. First and foremost, our climate-related governance structure and strategy, and that includes our climate risk plan and how we intend to manage that. Our strategy for reducing emissions for not only our operations, but for our financed emissions as well, which falls in that Scope 3 category. And then the progress that we've made in reviewing high carbon sectors. So we have identified a list of sectors that are either highly susceptible to transition risk or regulatory changes, as well as just high carbon intensive sectors such as cement or things like that. So, when we approach our TCFD report, we discuss our approach on how we tend to do this, and that really focuses on positive impact investing and reducing our impact on our emissions. So below or in front of you, you can see our governance strategy for climate-related risk and opportunities. We do have a climate risk management forum that's right in the middle of the diagram here. And you can see on the left of your screen that we have some key business partners which feed into that management forum. We found that you really need everybody at the table in order to have an effective strategy on this level. So we include everyone from compliance in business to investor relations, legal, strategy, and risk. I think one thing that is very important to note when it comes to the TCFD is that it's not just a sustainability or corporate social responsibility function. It really needs to include all business partners across the organization for you to build that effective strategy. And that's what we hope to convey here. So we do have the Climate Risk Management Forum. There's a dedicated climate risk team that supports that forum, as well as that forum then feeding all the way up to the board at the board level. So this is something that this is how we approach it. The second pillar for strategy really focuses on our climate change approach and how we're going to manage that for our financing portfolio. So we have 3 main areas where we identify as strategic pillars for this. The first is accelerating the sustainable finance strategy of the bank. So focusing on low carbon technologies and transition, and then building resilience to physical climate risk. So are we adapting our infrastructure to this future state of climate? Are we investing appropriately in that regard as well? Are we focusing on those areas that are most vulnerable? So we are aware that our portfolio can be exposed to things like high sea level rise, wildfires, and things like that. So are we investing in those areas where they really need it? The second theme is our direct emissions and our financed emissions. So do we have a strategy in place to manage our operations, our scope 1 and 2 emissions, and then our scope 3 emissions in our financed portfolio? We do have a target that's aligned to Paris. So we have a science-based target that we use for our scope 1 and 2 emissions. And that is really our driving force behind how we intend to align to that 2-degree scenario. And then thirdly, managing the financial risk from climate change. So are we building the infrastructure internally to assess climate risk? And are we building that into our standard risk profile at the bank? So we do have a definition of climate risk in our enterprise risk management framework. And it's pretty straightforward. It's the potential for financial and non-financial losses arising from climate change and our subsequent response to it. The third pillar is risk management. And one thing that we did in our most recent report is our approach to climate scenarios and how we started to embed this into our processes. So through that process, we've looked at 4 main scenarios, and they're outlined here. So there's a more orderly scenario, and then there's one that's more disruptive. And the orderly scenario is one where the market itself is a lot more proactive in identifying risks and then adapting to them. And disruptive is more of that kind of reaching the end of the cliff approach. So we don't really do anything until the very last minute, and then all of a sudden there's a bunch of change, either regulatory or in markets or something like that. So we've looked at all 4 of them, and this is how we've done it. So bottom left, low physical risk, low transition risk, all the way to the top right, which has severe risk and both physical and transition. After we've looked at the climate scenarios, we've started to put this into our risk taxonomy at the bank. So these are the 7 risk factors that we've identified that feed into climate risk. So we have the blue ones, which are the financial risks, so credit risk, operational, country-related risk. And then the green ones on the right are the non-financial. So regulatory compliance. So in the UK, we have the PRA has put out a bank stress test basically for climate. And then reputational. So what is Standard Chartered doing to really embed these climate-related risks into our process, because there is reputation risk going forward for institutions that do not. We've started to look at several risk assessment tools in order to do that, both on the physical risk and the transition risk side. For physical risk, we're currently piloting 2 different tools. The first one is by Munich Re, and that's actually the screenshot that you can see in the bottom left. It's a tool to identify physical risk at a location level. And in fact, this is our headquarters in London on that map there. But what you can see is it looks across a whole host of scenarios and risk factors: flooding, fire, earthquakes, tsunami, etc. And then it comes up with a metric basically of high risk, low risk. And this tool will allow us to do this across the entire portfolio. The second one is on the transition risk side. So we've been involved with the 2-degree investing initiative for several years. It's a European-based think tank focused on transition risk. And they have a tool called the Paris Agreement Capital Transition Assessment, or PACTA, which is being piloted by several banks to focus on that transition risk. One of the key features of that tool is it focuses on high transition risk sectors. So I think there's about 8 of them, and we're really focused on auto, cement, steel, fossil fuels, shipping, as well as a couple others, where there's really been identified as high transition risk, either from a regulatory perspective or a technology perspective, and identifying those risks. So we're kind of moving into the third and fourth pillar here about risk management and then metrics and targets. This is from our most recent report, and this is our exposure to these sectors. So you can see, from 2017 to 2019, our exposure is about the same. Maybe it's a little bit less, but more or less it's the same. But I think the really interesting thing here is maturity. So one thing that we've done when we're looking at transition risk is how exposed is the portfolio based on a maturity basis. And you can see, if we just use auto for an example, 70% of our loans are maturity of less than 1 year. So what that says to us is we aren't really exposed from a long-term perspective because the turnover is so high. After we've gone through this process, we've determined that 10% of our loans and advances are exposed to short-term risk. So we feel pretty pretty confident about where we are in a resiliency scenario. So lastly, I wanted to show you a little bit of a deeper dive into one of those sectors, and so this is our portfolio emissions intensity for the cement industry. On the left side of the chart, we have it broken out by region. So Africa, Middle East is on the left, followed by ASEAN, South Asia, Europe, the Americas, and China. And what we can see is that while a lot of our loans are more in the Africa, Middle East section, the emissions intensity of the product is actually greater in other markets. So when we're looking at a strategy to manage the emissions intensity of the portfolio, it's not enough to identify the volume, but it's also really important to identify where those markets are and where your concentrations are, because trying to align a portfolio to certain climate change risk scenarios is a lot more comprehensive than just at the cement level, or sorry, at the industry level. So one of the things that we continue to do is identify where most of that intensity resides. So lastly, for metrics and targets, and this is my last slide, so I'm going to be wrapping up here shortly. We use several metrics and targets to guide our approach. We've aligned to the Paris Agreement for our operations, and we've done that through a science-based target setting process. And we have a variety of partners in that process to do that and manage it. We set targets on investment for clean technology. So we did have one, which was $4 billion by 2020. We've succeeded there, and we've achieved that. And now we have set a new one. So $35 billion in clean technology and renewable by 2025. And that's something that we will continue to report on in our process. We set time-bound thresholds to exit clients in thermal coal. So starting in January 2021, we're going to start exiting clients who are 100% dependent on thermal coal, tapering all the way down to 10% dependency in 2030. And then continual monitoring of our loans and advances for carbon-related sectors. So we continue to build out the processes internally to identify where those high carbon exposures are, how do we manage them going forward, and how do we mitigate those impacts at the bank. So that's all I have for today. So thank you very much. I hope you guys enjoyed that. And I'm going to turn it back over to Soraya. Thank you.
Thank you, Ryan, for a very insightful presentation. Moving on to Q&A session. We have received good questions from the audience. So I've clustered the questions into a few categories. Maybe we can start with board and governance related questions. So these questions are directed to CDP. So does CDP offers training or advisory for boards intending to adopt climate related strategies? And the other one on board related, is there an increasing trend of boards oversight on climate related risks? If yes, what do you think is the reasons for this increasing trend? Maybe Eileen and Hani can take these questions.
Yeah, thank you for the question. To the first part of the question, so we do receive a lot more inquiries from companies in Southeast Asia and also Hong Kong for TCFD training and or master classes. So we definitely see a growing demand, and we also provide trainings on demand. If it is something that your organization is looking to, then feel free to reach out to us. And for the second part of the questions regarding board level oversight, so we are definitely seeing a growing trend with C-suite senior management. They're being tasked or responsible for climate-related issues, and they are, or CDP, considered best practice to report to the board more frequently, quarterly or more frequent than that. So we are seeing more companies are reporting more frequently and also have C-suite level management to look after climate-related issues. And also, just to add that CDP does year-on-year analysis after our score release. So early next year, we'll be having a launch event as well, and we will be disclosing more findings from our 2020 disclosure cycle. So something to stay tuned.
All right. Thank you, Edith. Moving on to the next questions, I think this is directed to Ryan. Ryan, what are the top 3 key challenges and how do we address them? Maybe Ryan can help answer this question. I'm sure participants would also like to hear from you, to get some advice from you on the areas they should focus on if they would like to start disclosing climate risk and opportunities. Yes.
Great. Yeah, thank you for the question. So I think, for the key challenges as it relates to disclosure, I think firstly, data availability is always a challenge. One of the things that needs to be addressed early on is how are we actually going to identify or collect the data and then set a strategy upon that, and then report upon that. And so, I think data is always a challenge, especially if your portfolio is slanted heavily towards private companies where that public disclosure may not be there. Quick plug for CDP. That's a great opportunity for climate-related disclosures and a good resource for that. But I think it's always going to be a challenge, and it's something that we still struggle with, is making sure that we can have access to that. And then I think the next challenge is kind of is regulation going to kind of catch up to where we see this kind of like quasi-regulatory environment, like with the TCFD. Are we ever going to kind of get to a point where we have more alignment there? I think that's still a challenge, and it's something that we're encountering.
On the focus area, maybe you can suggest few areas that companies can focus on.
I'm sorry, was that for me?
Yes. Yes, right.
Can you repeat the question, please?
When companies want to start disclosing, what are the areas that they should focus on?
So yeah, I think early on for reporting, I would say don't try to start simple, right? So identify what's actually available to you, and then what can you report on. When it comes to governance, it doesn't have to be a very detailed process. Just what are the processes that you have in place? Are they related to climate risk? Are you and then just explain it, right? the most important thing is just trying to get this disclosure out there. And it doesn't have to be this very extensive reporting process. It can be very straightforward. And so, that would be my first bit of advice is, just telling your story and disclosing and not worrying about, do you have the answers to everything? This is going to be a process, right? I mean, there's a lot of improvement that goes on, and you can see that from our 2018 report to our 2019 report, and then hopefully, in our next report. There's always opportunities to get better and disclose more. So, don't worry about if you don't have all the answers right.
All right, thank you, Ryan. Moving on to the next question is on matrices. Maybe Ilim can help to answer these few questions. In what situations are target and matrices used? Is it being used for IT companies? And the next on matrices, does CDP plan to share the best practices for matrices and targets for specific sector? For example, the financial sector and IT-related industry.
Yeah, thank you for the question. And as for best practice, CDP is very proud to be one of the most transparent disclosure platforms. So all of our guidance document and scoring methodologies are publicly available and can be viewed from our website. So in those documents, we always highlight and promote best practices. So if you're interested, you can take a look. And of course, our guidance document are also structured according to the TCFD recommendations. So you can easily look at, for example, for targets and metrics, what is considered as best practice. And also, I mentioned just now in my presentation, having a verified science-based target would be considered as best practice in terms of target setting. And this is not limited to specific sectors. Instead, it's applicable to all sectors. For specific sectors, we will have a sector-specific questionnaire where we add additional questions or adjust some of the questions to fit into those industries. And so the TCFD in general as well is applicable to all sectors.
Sorry, Soraya. Can I add on? My apology for my breakdown in audio earlier. But when it comes to specifically for banks best practices, we do have a CDP A list. And part of it are also banks, which I've highlighted in my presentation slides, such as Citigroup, Bank of America, Morgan Stanley, and all these A-list banks. You are able to view the response at our website because all their responses are publicly available.
Thank you, Hani.
No worries.
Next question is to all panelists. This is based on engagement with clients from various regions. Is climate risk really a main concern of Southeast Asia investors or companies vis-a-vis social issues? Very interesting question. Maybe CDP as well as Ryan can help answer this question.
Sure. So I'm happy to kick us off. So, I mean, we are getting a lot of questions from clients, all over, but specifically in Southeast Asia, on how to start implementing this process around climate and sustainability into their business. So we do engage quite often with clients. On an advisory level, about strategies for kind of moving forward in this low carbon economy. Additionally, I mean, I think the social side is also really important, right? Because I think sometimes that gets lost a bit in the conversation around environment and climate. And, there is another bit here for the social bit. And so when we're engaging with clients, it's not just on the environmental level, it's across the board. And we do get a lot of questions from our clients here in this area.
So yeah, so earlier I mentioned we are requesting this climate-related information on behalf of 515 investor signatories, and you can, of course, many of them are global banks or financial institutions, but also some have Southeast Asia focus. So when we are requesting companies to disclose, we are requesting on behalf of these investor signatories, and these provide a big incentives to companies to disclose. And also, last year we have run a non-disclosures campaign where our investor will highlight or pick some of the companies, their customers that they are particularly interested in, and send them a letter to ask them again to provide more pressure to ask them to disclose to CDP. So definitely we are seeing we think more companies, and also from our statistics, year on year, we have a very steady growth of disclosure. Even this year, it's a very difficult year. We still have a growth in Southeast Asia. So definitely seeing it as a growing trend.
How do we justify the climate impact into dollar and cent? This is one of the questions posed by one of the participants. How do we quantify that into financial reporting?
Is this addressed to CDP or?
Maybe Ryan can take up this question.
Yeah, I think it's a great question. So in terms of climate impact, I think there's probably a couple approaches you could take. If we look at a specific sector like power generation, you could look at different technologies and the investment that would go into renewables, for example, as opposed to like a traditional fossil fuel plant. And then the subsequent impact of that project, right, over time. So I think there's a couple of ways you can go about it. But I think it's a question that we're still trying to identify. And I think one thing that TCFD does, because it's so focused on disclosure, is it makes you look into your portfolio and identify at least what the risk is, right? And so once you've identified the risk, then you can move into the opportunity. I don't know if I answered the question, but I'll stop there.
Yeah, that actually leads to the next question, which is on ESG overall. Is the decrease in SC's exposure to high-risk sectors attributed to making more ESG-conscious financial decisions, or through working with existing clients by helping them transition to be more ESG compliant?
Yeah, I think it's a mix of both. So we do have our positions at the bank that say what we will and will not do. I think coal investment is one of those. So we do have prohibitions on certain activities. We don't invest in thermal coal. We don't finance coal-fired power stations. We have expectations of clients in certain industries that they're going to hold certifications, so like RSPO for palm oil, for example, and then other restrictions on other activities such as like Arctic drilling or something like that. So we do have some pretty strong requirements that we expect of our clients, and those are the conversations that we have with them on an ongoing basis. How can we work with you to make you more more sustainable, or how can we help you transition so your impact can be lower? So I think it's a mixture of both.
Okay. As Standard Chartered move towards stringent practices and encourage more disclosure, how much is expected economic value created or cost savings to stakeholders? This is one of the questions.
That's a great question, and I'm afraid I don't know the answer to that offhand. But yeah, I mean, we're expecting some return. I don't think it's been quantified yet as of today, but it is something that we're working on.
Okay. Okay, moving on to the next question. How different is TCFD to UNEP-FI, PRB? Any example of banks embracing both PRB principle of responsible banking? Maybe Elim can take up this question.
Yeah, so first of all, the differentiation between PRI and CDP is that PRI focus on ESG all aspects, but where CDP has a very heavy focus on E and G. So in terms of our climate change questionnaire, it is fully TCFD aligned, and it is a very heavy climate focus. So that's one main differences. So and then what is the second question? Sorry.
Any example of banks embracing both PRB principle of responsible banking?
Right. Perhaps Hani maybe can add, and also Ryan, of course, can add on that. But I noticed many companies are actually reporting to multiple platforms, and it actually can help them because, of course, some of the material can be reused and also make their job easier by using the information already existing in the organization and can report to multiple platforms. For example, if you are reporting to DJSI, then you can also attach a CDP response in your submission. And among different reporting frameworks, we are constantly looking for more alignment to ease companies' reporting burden. And that's why we don't see it. You can, in fact, many companies do so. They report to different platforms.
There's a question that just came in. Why TCFD? What is the comparative advantage for company adopting TCFD compared to other disclosure standards like GRI?
So TCFD specifically address the rising climate-related risk and opportunities, and because this is a more concerning issue, we need a specific framework to address it and make sure the information companies are disclosing can satisfy investors' needs in order to make informed financial decisions. So for other framework like GRI, I also mentioned and cited it in my presentation, and the results of that mapping exercise done by the Better Alignment Project, CDP's questionnaire is more aligned. It's fully aligned to TCFD, and this is because our questionnaires were structured around TCFD. So first, why TCFD? Because the investors asking for decision, why? Because CDP is aligned with TCFD.
Thank you, Edith. For FIs that have not started this journey, is it advisable to roll out TCFD during COVID-19 year? Maybe we can hear from Elim as well as Ryan.
Sure. So I think I think one of the key questions in there is, do you have the capacity internally to move forward with something like that today, right? So We know that a lot of certain business lines are maybe overstressed right now because of COVID. Maybe they don't have the capacity to take on something new. I don't think it's I don't think it's a requirement. I think if you can still move ahead, I would absolutely recommend it. I think the question is, do you have enough internal capacity to manage something like TCFD today? Because it is something that is wide-ranging across many different groups within the bank. So you do need to have legal there, compliance there. You need a whole host of people involved in the process. So if the capacity is there, absolutely. But I think that's kind of more of a business, business question.
Ilim or Hani, do you have anything to add?
Maybe just on behalf of Hani, I know Hani is leading a pilot which is the one she just presented on. That is a pilot questionnaire for banks, and it just rolled out last year or early this year. So for this year's disclosure cycle, actually. So interestingly, we have targeted this year as a pilot year for banks to disclose aligned with TCFD, and also I think because of the COVID situation, it also draw our attention to how to build back better. And TCFD is a very useful tool for us to transform to a low carbon economy. And of course, we understand the situation has put a lot of companies in difficult circumstances, but yeah, if we want to build back better, I believe this is the right track we should follow.
Thank you, Ilim. We have a few more questions, but we are getting close to the end of our time. So Ryan, maybe could you take up these few questions because it's actually directed to you. So the first question is, to be a responsible financier, what if banks refrain from financing projects that impact climate change if the risk cannot be mitigated appropriately or satisfactorily? What are your views or any comments? That's one. And the other one, the definition of high transition risk sectors are based on what source?
Sure. So perhaps I'll take the second one first. In my presentation, when we were discussing high transition risk sectors, that's a definition that was defined with our partner 2D Investing. We're in a pilot with several other banks, and that's the definition that we use within there. So it's sectors that are more exposed to regulatory changes, and that includes target carbon pricing or things like that, as well as ones that are highly exposed to technology changes. So automotive moving from combustion engines to electric. So that's kind of how we've defined those 8 sectors. But that was in partnership with our partner. In terms of financing projects that if the risk cannot be mitigated, that's just kind of part of our process. So we have various frameworks that we follow, such as the Equator Principles and the IFC performance standards, where we do try to identify risks and then put in plans to mitigate them. If they cannot be mitigated, or if they're not mitigated to our satisfaction, then I do believe as an institution you have a responsibility to make a decision, and that can be walking away. I think it's important to have those policies in place at your institution to understand what your expectations are. If climate risk is one of those risk factors that is really part and parcel to the strategy, then there may be times where you will walk away from projects, and that's I think that's part of this evolution when we're talking about climate risk, is treating it like a financial risk, and it needs to be held at that same level. If it's not a viable project, it's not a viable project.
Okay, thank you, Ryan. maybe can you take up one last question before we end this session? Because we still have 5 minutes. But let me try to summarize the question. So there's one question: which combinations of assets could be affected by climate-related risks? How much and how quickly? Who holds those assets? And to what extent are losses mitigated by public and private shock absorber? Maybe Ryan, you can answer the question. Are you trying to say something? Sorry, I can't hear Hani or Eileen and Ryan as well.
I'm here.
Okay.
So yeah, I mean, I think so. The assets that would be more exposed to climate-related risk. You know, I mean, I think the tenor of the loan. I mean, so if we're talking about long-term climate risk impacts, the longer the tenor, the more exposed you are to climate-related risks. You know, I think one of the challenges right now is that oftentimes climate-related risk is a longer-term time horizon than kind of the shorter-term time horizon that we're used to talking about in terms of strategy. So the longer out you go, then the more exposed you are. And then, as I just said a minute or two ago, I mean, certain asset classes and certain industries are going to be more exposed. But that's one of the objectives that TCFD does is tries to identify those sectors and then your exposure. And that's as you go through the process, you'll identify those.
All right. Thank you. Thank you so much, Ryan. I would like to thank the presenters for the great presentation and sharing of information. To the participants, thank you for joining us. Slides will be provided for all participants after the webinar. We appreciate feedback from participants. Please fill in the feedback form which is available in the chat box. Take care, everyone, and have a great day.
I believe there has been an engaging conversation that we have today with a lot of questions being shared with the audience. Thank you to all the panelists, Elim, Hani, and Ryan, for their thoughts and insightful experience that they have shared today. To Suraya for successfully moderating today's event. I would like to say a big thank you to all of you, especially to all the participants that are joining us today. Please do participate in our upcoming webinars, and we'll see you in the next sustainable webinar on 22nd October 2020. This is Khairi, signing off on behalf of IFIM and the rest of our partners. Assalamualaikum. Bye-bye.